Konflikt 47 is the Weird War II game from Warlord Games. It depicts a continuation of World War II, albeit with sci-fi elements like high-tech weaponry and genetic engineering. And in this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to paint one of the larger vehicles from that game. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and today I'll be showing you how to paint the Soviet Mastadon Heavy Walker. As always, my first step was to prime the model. Primers create a surface that the paint can properly adhere to, as well as giving us a uniform colour to start the painting process against, which is especially important when your model is a mixture of resin and metal parts like this one. Now, there are many methods to priming, be it aerosol, airbrush or brush on, and what you choose is entirely up to you. However, the colour choice, in this case black, was particularly important. I needed something that would help to create shading in the recessed areas so that I wouldn't need to go back with excessive washes. When painting larger vehicles like this, a lot of people like to use airbrushes as they can cover large areas quickly and help to create gradients nice and easy. But not everyone has an airbrush. Luckily, similar effects can be achieved by dry brushing. To dry brush, I took a large brush and dipped it into the light tan of skeleton bone before wiping away the excess paint onto a tissue. This also helped to work the paint more evenly through the bristles. Once the brush was prepped, I could next start to apply some light but quick brush strokes to the surface of the vehicle. The combination of this brushing action and the small amount of paint left in the bristles caused the paint to only accumulate onto the flat panels and raised details, but not into those recessed areas. As the model had been primed black and so the recesses remained black, the result was some instant shading. Now, to create the appearance of light falling on the model from above, I focused my application mainly towards the flat panels and the top halves of the more vertical panels. This resulted in everything underneath the model being left completely black and a series of gradients on other parts of the model, moving from the darker to the lighter areas. At this point, I had a tank that had a tan and black colour scheme. However, I wanted to recreate the faded green of World War II era Soviet tanks. So to remedy this, I once again turned to dry brushing. But instead of skeleton bone, I instead opted for army green, but followed the exact same process as before, applying paint quickly over the surfaces and hard edges, whilst leaving the recesses dark. Now, some of you may be wondering why I didn't just use this paint in the first place, instead of applying it the skeleton bone first. The main reason for this was to give the green a much lighter base colour, which allowed the true colour of army green to show through, instead of a dull washed out green that would have occurred if I had painted straight over the top of the black. Another reason for this two-step approach was to help smooth out the transitions that were created in that previous step. As the dry brushing applies only a thin layer of paint, the transition can still be seen through it, but the gradient no longer appears as rough as it did before. Following on from the previous steps of helping to smooth out the transitions, whilst also adding a little more shading in the recesses, I next began to apply some of the Wash Military Shader. This was thinned out with some quick shade mixing medium to reduce its intensity, before being applied over the whole model. As I was applying this, I made sure that the wash didn't pool too heavily in any single location, which would have dried to create strangely placed patches of darker green. By applying this wash evenly across the model, it helped to add a little shading to some of the details that dry brushing may have covered over completely. Continuing with the armour of the Mastodon, my next task was to start to add a little weathering and texture to the vehicle's surface. First, I wanted to add some paint chips, and a simple way of doing this is with a piece of foam or sponge instead of a brush. When foam is ripped, it creates an irregular surface, which means that when it's dipped into paint, wiped onto some paper, and then applied to the model, it creates some equally irregularly shaped paint chips. The paint I chose for this step was Necrotic Flesh. It has a similarly green hue to the army green, but was much lighter. When applied over the darker green, the chips would look as though they were catching the light, and so would be more three-dimensional appearance. I focused this light sponging around the areas that would receive the most wear and tear. This included the hard edges, the areas where the crew would work, as well as the large dozer blade at the front. By lightly applying this paint in uneven patterns, I was able to create a much less pristine appearance. In addition to the sponging, I also used some Necrotic Flesh alongside a fine tip brush to paint some roughly horizontal scratches across the panels of the tank. These faint lines help to build upon the weathering by creating the appearance of bullet ricochets or scratches as the large walker pushes through obstacles. To represent some of the deeper scratches and chips where the paint has been removed completely, revealing the metal surface beneath, I used some Necromancer Cloak alongside a fine brush. This dark grey gave the impression that the chips were much deeper and really boosted that 3D effect. Using the tip of a fine brush, I applied the paint in small dots along some of the hard edges and the areas that already had Necrotic Flesh chips applied. The result is areas of light damage with small spots of heavier damage. In addition to painting the chips, I also used Necromancer Cloak to base coat the metallic areas of the model, such as the protruding machine gun barrels and the hydraulics that were found across the Mastodon's legs. For the Soviet stars dotted across the model, I wanted a rich red and so chose Abomination Gore. Now these areas already had some gradient applied to them from when I tackled the rest of the hull, so by applying a slightly watered down paint I was able to continue this gradient, albeit with red paint instead of green. For the hammer and sickle mounted on these stars, I chose to use the paint Sulphide Ochre. It's a slightly orangely tinted yellow, which creates a golden effect, perfect for representing the Soviet icon without the use of metallic paints. At the rear of the Mastodon was a large exhaust. Now this could have been painted green like the rest of the model, but to help add a little contrast against the green hull, whilst also building on the weathered appearance, I decided to make it look heavily rusted instead. The idea being that the heat has removed any paint from it, leaving it exposed to the elements. Now the colour I chose for this base coat of this rusted metal was the deep red of Chaotic Red. This colour was a great starting point to build upon in the next few steps. To create the uneven patchy rust effect over the exhaust, I used some of the reddish orange of Mars Red, following a similar idea to the paint chipping. I used my brush in a dabbing motion to create patches of the reddish orange over the surface of the rust. With the same dabbing motion that I used in the last step, I continued to add some very dark brown patches of Hardened Carapace. By combining patches of these three red, brown and orange colours, I was able to create a fairly realistic looking rust effect. With the rust completed, I moved on to adding a little metallic sheen to the model. Using some gunmetal, I applied some thin edge highlights over the machine gun barrels and the hydraulics that I painted using the Necromancer Cloak. The combination of the dark grey of the base coat and the fine highlights of gunmetal resulted in the effect of a blackened steel. The final step in painting the Mastodon was to complete the weathering with another wash. This time around I used some strong tone wash because of its dark brown colour. With this wash I was able to create some thin vertical streaks across the hull of the vehicle, recreating the effect of rain causing rust and dirt to run down the sides. I applied a thin line, allowed it to dry and then applied another line over the top to help darken it down even further. This line was then topped with a small dot of the wash. In addition to these streaks, I also applied the wash in a more traditional way. I targeted this around areas that I would expect dirt to accumulate around, mainly the legs and the dozer blade. However, I also applied the wash around the hatches located on the hull. This would create the appearance of dirt building up as the crew would climb in and out of the vehicle. With this step completed, all I needed to do was to apply a layer of matte varnish to remove the slight sheen from the surface, which left me with this. And here we have the completed Mastodon. Now while this guide focused on a Mastodon, the scheme could be used to paint other Soviet vehicles too, and not just those from Konflikt 47. The colours and methods are ideal for your regular bolt-action vehicles too, such as your T-34s or your KV2s. So thank you for joining me for this painting guide, and I hope that you've enjoyed watching and that you've been able to learn something from it as well. As I said, all the paints that we use in the creation of this guide can be found at the bottom of this video's description. If you'd like to support me and pick up some bolt action or other historical miniatures, then head on over to Warlord Games using my affiliates link below. Anything you buy will send a little money my way at no extra cost to yourselves. If you enjoyed this guide, then please do let me know, along with any other Warlord game painting guides that you would like to see me tackle in the future. And so until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.